nagabili dito. So there was a whole class, professor levels. Okay, this is what I prepared for today, but it's actually a paper, much longer paper. I did a research project on martial law technocrats. It's a much bigger project. And my part in this project was to look at the role of the Marcos technocrats in rural development, and specifically in my case, the agrarian reform program. And what I would like to look at is the role of the chief technocrat himself in the agrarian reform program. So this is an aspect of Cesar Virata's tenure as finance minister and prime minister. It is little known that he actually had a hand in the conceptualization and implementation of Marcos's agrarian reform program, which many scholars know was a colossal failure. So the outline of my presentation, I hope to keep within the 20-minute time limit, but if not, I would like to take the indulgence of the organizers. Okay, next please. During the martial law regime of Ferdinand Marcos, Filipino technocrats played a major role in conceptualizing and implementing a land reform program that was called by Marcos himself the cornerstone of the new society. But for all their expertise, the technocrats failed to assure the success of the program and may have even contributed to its dearth of accomplishment after 13 years of representation. And this failure can be traced to a development paradigm pursued by Marcos and the technocrats because of its bias for elite big business concerns, which contradicted the distributive justice and equity-based principles of agrarian reform. Leading technocrats like Cesar E.A, Prime Minister and concurrent Finance Minister, and more important, Chairman of the Land Bank, the Agrarian Reforms Financing Institution, originally came from the academic, UP, but honed their skills in the corporate business world, from where their mindsets became inextricably wired. But let's look at technocracy first as a concept and a practice. Technocracy has been defined as a form of government in which decisions would be based exclusively on technical considerations. A regime in which the government's actions would be the result of an absolute rationalization of social mechanisms. So the technocracy thesis holds that human beings are mere cogs in the social machinery, objects of technical control, in much the same way as raw materials and the natural environment. Technocrats therefore are viewed as a conservative power block under the capitalist state apparatus. And they are conscious and are conscious allies of existing economic and social elites. While generally assumed or expected to be neutral, technocrats in government share the same educational and social background as industrialists and business managers, and are therefore likely to share their ideas, prejudices, and general outlook. Because of this, it cancels the supposedly inherent advantage of a technocratic regime with its avowed emphasis on merit, professionalism, technical skills, rather than birth or political connections. This implies that the very same circumstances that promote technocratic control is inimical to democratic rule. And we have this disjuncture between technocracy on the one hand and democracy on the other, because it puts at risk some standard democratic features as accountability, checks and balances, political representation, and transparency. And then the close ties between business and technocrats give rise to what is called a revolving door, where government recruits its top bureaucrats from the business sector, while the business sector taps technocrats who have either left their public positions or have retired. Now, this depiction of the technocracy is true and clearly relevant in the Philippine case, especially during the martial rule period imposed by Marcos from 1972 to 1986. It was a regime that was bannered as one where technocrats had a role to play within a state committed to modernization. It is thus important to determine what role technocrats played in propping up the dictatorship and providing a justification to continued martial rule. And my paper focuses on Marcos's acknowledged chief technocrat, Cesar E.A. Virata. It's, by the way, Enrique, not Emilio. It highlights his participation in and his own insights on the relative law program. So, Virata, as we all know, earned 2 BS degrees, mechanical engineering and business at the UP, cum laude, was an instructor at the UP College of Business Administration, and secured his MBA from the prestigious Wharton Graduate School, University of Pennsylvania, under a U.S. government fellowship grant. Virata says that, by the way, before I go on, I'd like to say that a lot of what is personally ascribed to Virata is the result of a series of interviews done with Viratans by a team composed of Cayetano Padalanga Jr., Yutaka Katayama, Teresa Encarnacion Tadem, and Mario Rivera, under a project of called Martial Law Technocrats. Virata says that it was during his American education that he began to see himself as a technocrat. He later became Dean of the UP College of Business Administration, and in that capacity facilitated the graduate studies in the U.S. of other future Marcos technocrats, like Manuel Alba and Jaime Laya. Other soon-to-be martial law technocrats like Paterno, Cabella, and Mapa also secured their graduate degrees from U.S. universities. When they came back, most of them entered what would be the main training ground for Filipino technocrats in the 1950s. And this was the accounting consultancy firm of SGP, C.C. Flores Velayo, which had among its clients the country's largest firms as well as multinational corporations. Virata joined SGP in 1956 as a full-time business executive, where he was exposed to major industrial sectors and where he established ties with American multinationals, such as United Fruit and Castle & Co, agribusiness giants, then exploring plantation ventures in Mindanao. The next logical step for Virata was to join government, and along with Manuel Alba and Jaime Laya, initially did consultancy work for several state agencies, such as Bureau of Customs, NAWASA, PCSO, etc. In 1967, President Marcos appointed Virata as Deputy Director General for Investments of the Presidential Economic Staff, Undersecretary for Industry, Director and Acting Chairman of the Philippine National Bank, Co-Chairman of the Joint RP-US Trade and Investments Panel, and Chairman of the Board of Investments. In 1971, he was elevated to the Marcos Cabinet as Secretary of Finance, where his major task was to attract foreign capital. As Finance Secretary, he served concurrently as Chairman of the Land Bank of the Philippines, which was organized specifically to support the government's agrarian reform program. In September 1972, Virata was in the United States, participating in a World Bank meeting, when he learned, to his surprise, that Marcos had declared martial law. While initially skeptical of the need for such a draconian measure, he eventually came around to rationalizing it as a way of jump-starting Philippine economic development. He also thought, quite naively I might say, that it would be no different from what other Asian governments, example, Indonesia, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, which already had in place an authoritarian and capital-friendly government. In 1981, as a result of the cosmetic lifting of martial law, Marcos unilaterally inaugurated a French-style parliamentary system of government and designated Virata as Prime Minister and head of the cabinet, although Marcos retained the presidency and all of his martial law powers. Virata's power and influence were actually limited by the existence of other powerful political and economic factions and personalities in government. But his main source of influence was his closeness with and the confidence he enjoyed from the country's foreign multilateral and bilateral donors, such as the IMF, World Bank, the ADB, and the US, Japanese, and West European governments. Marcos' development strategy was basically that of developing a business-oriented and foreign capital-friendly economic base. And because of this, Marcos preferred those technocrats who shared his vision of an economy open to foreign investment. Thus, he gave preference to the foreign investment-based plan, of Arman Pabella and Cesar E.A himself. Against that, the protectionist and nationalist recommendations of, for example, the National Economic Council, which was then headed by Hilarion Henares. Serious fundamental contradictions surfaced, however, and in the area of socio-economic development strategies, there was that contradiction, a very basic contradiction, between a productivity-oriented initiatives on one hand and equity-oriented approaches on the other. And in the conceptualization and implementation of rural development in general and agrarian reform program in particular, this paradigmatic conflict will be played out in typical fashion. Now, what is agrarian reform all about? David Werfel says that agrarian reform is a complex of policies designed specifically to transform rural society in the direction of greater equality of wealth and power among groups and classes, and of greater equality of opportunity for individuals. To be truly redistributive, agrarian reform must reflect on the pre-existing agrarian structure and change of ownership and control over land resources, wherein such a change flows strictly from landed to landless and land-poor classes, and from rich landlords to poor peasants and rural workers. But what was the Marcos agrarian reform program all about? Upon declaring martial law in 1972, Marcos also declared the whole country a land reform area and ordered the emancipation of tenants from their bondage and transferring to them the ownership of the land they tilled. Marcos' land reform program, however, retained the limited program scope of previous agrarian laws that covered only tenanted rights to foreign lands. Thus, even if totally implemented, such a program would have benefited only 45% of tenants, 12% of landowners, 56% of land area of all rice and corn lands, 5% of the rural labor force, and 31% of all tenanted farmland area, and 8% of all farmlands. The problem with the program, there were also other inadequacies. One was a conservative vision within the land reform bureaucracy, resulting in a pervasive absence of political will, patronage and corruption, and an implementation that was organized around landowners rather than tenants, with the result of increasing production costs under the Green Revolution program, failure of the small farmer credit program, beneficiaries incurring huge declines in real incomes and losing control over their lands. And as far as the tenant beneficiaries are concerned, a very high payment default rate that reached 90% by the early 1980s. What was the record of agrarian reform under Marcos, even within that very limited scope? 3 weeks before he was ousted, only 2.2% of land had been distributed, representing a mere 2.2% of targeted program area. A pitifully meager outcome, despite 13 years and 4 months of absolute power resting in the hands of only one man. The failure of Marcos's land reform resulted in the increase of land inequality by the 90s, with a Gini coefficient of 57 compared to 53 in the 1960s. The tenurial status of poor farmers also declined. Tenancy increased from 33% to 36% in the number of farms, and from 26% to 27% in the percent of farm area. For all croplands, tenancy actually also grew from 29% to 33.4%. Now, Cesar Virata was the highest ranking technocrat with powers over the land reform program, directly by virtue of his chairmanship of the land bank, and later indirectly as Prime Minister. In a series of interviews, Virata echoed Marcos's view on the land reform, and I quote, "We have a long history of resettlement, even before the war. Marcos said that this issue of crop sharing had not solved the problem. He said, I'm referring to the 70-30 sharing because there was a crop sharing law that was passed." Now, my comment on this was, the green reform, of course, is not only about resettlement. Marcos's and Virata's view reflect confusion about what the problem was and the solutions that were offered. The crop sharing system was not the solution, it was part of the problem. Virata also outlined the justification for a new agrarian reform law. Again, as Marcos explained to him, and I quote Virata, Marcos explained his reason for the land reform decree. Rather than for the landowners to lose their land to the new people's army, we better have agrarian reform for the farmers so that they will be with us and not with the NPA. Now, this statement only confirms the notion of various scholars that the basic driving motivation of Marcos's government land reform was indeed counterinsurgency. For Virata, land reform is part of agriculture. And this reflects, quote unquote, he says land reform is part of agriculture. And this reflects a framework far removed from the program's social justice rationale in reducing agrarian reform to its bare technical considerations. From this simple assumption, Virata explains the decision to limit land coverage only to rice and corn lands. And he said, and I quote again, "We decided that agrarian reform should be confined only to rice and corn lands. In the case of sugar, we thought that plantations were more suitable to sugarcane cultivation. In coconut plantation owners were saying that there were really no large coconut plantations. We did not include coconut and sugar plantations because of efficiency considerations and competitiveness." Unquote. This seemingly sacrosanct belief that big farms are more efficient and more competitive than small farms on grounds of economies of scale was actually made less conclusive by scientific studies done by Gayami, Adriano, and Pusinti, who pointed out that economies of scale do not exist for most tree crops such as coconuts, coffee, cacao, and rubber, and that although some scale economies may arise due to the need for large tractors in sugarcane production, it is not difficult for small growers to achieve an efficiency equal to that of large plantations, so long as rental market for cost of plowing services exists. And they concluded by saying that as a matter of fact, no significant difference in yield per hectare seems to exist between plantations and small growers of banana and pineapple. Virata's analysis of ownership of coconut lands being the product of savings by ordinary employees falls or fell flat in the light of data that clearly show that land ownership in coconut lands is highly concentrated, with 2% of coconut farms owning 1.25 million hectares, or 40% of total area, while 91% of coconut farms, occupied only 32% of total coconut lands. Now, what was Virata's role as land bank chairman? It must be clear that the land bank was established specifically with a mandate to support the land reform program and manage the purchase of lands covered by its land acquisition component. Now, when he took over as land bank chairman, Virata amended the bank's charter to convert it into a universal bank. Now, Sixto P. Rojas Jr., who drew up the original concept of the land bank and was its first governor, told Virata that this conversion was a mistake. Rojas explained that what would happen was that those involved in the universal bank component of land bank would now become what we call senior citizens, while those involved in the land reform component of the land bank would become junior citizens. Now, the land bank under Virata's leadership bears a large amount of responsibility for the land reform's colossal failure. Among the 6 stages in the implementation of Operation Land Transfer, it was in the 4th stage, land valuation, and this stage was the responsibility of the land bank, that the process bogged down continually and the largest amount of backlogs were registered. Of the many problems and inadequacies of Marcos's land reform program, the majority of them could be traced to the workings of the land bank under Cesar Virata's chairmanship. And I have here a number of problems that I'm not going into that. So for all the vaunted expertise and modernized methods that it was able to mobilize behind it, including a state apparatus unencumbered by countervailing institutional restraints and checks on its political power, the Marcos-Virata martial law regime failed miserably to carry out its land reform program, even within its extremely limited program scope. Where then and for what purpose were the extraordinary authority of martial law and technocratic know-how eventually utilized and successfully exercised in the socio-economic initiatives the Philippine countryside? The answer to this question was evident in the early years of martial law, when in 1974 the dictator inaugurated the corporate farming program, which turned out to be the direct opposite, direct contradictory to the land reform program. The most glaring feature of this productivity biased corporate farming program was its conflict with the regime's equity-oriented land reform, as it concentrated land in the hands of big corporate players, where the average farm reached 402 hectares, in contrast to the land reform's objective of breaking up large estates into family farms of not more than 5 hectares each. A bitter irony here is that the total farm area acquired by big corporations under the corporate farming program was 445% greater than the measly 15,000 hectares that had been transferred to land reform beneficiaries in 13 years and 4 months of martial law land reform. Corporate incursions into the Philippine countryside have exacerbated the unequal social and economic relations between the rural rich and the rural poor. These are even more disruptive for poor peasants when multinational corporations are involved. It is clear that in the rural development strategy of the Marcos Virata regime, corporate and plantation-style farming easily superseded and took the upper hand over the agrarian reform program and its land redistribution component as the principal means for countryside development. As Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and Chief Technocrat, Cesar Virata presided over this strategy and consistently backstopped his principal, Ferdinand Marcos, in prioritizing and favoring a productivity-oriented and economic efficiency path of rural development over an equity-oriented and redistributive justice model. I know my position. Okay, before I go into that, just take note of this slide. This is what happened after 14 years of martial law to the rural areas in the Philippines. In the Philippine and Southeast Asian experiences during the 60s and the 1970s, the technocratic approach has been identified with developmental authoritarianism and as a response and an alternative to movements for social change, in other words, revolutionary movements. This developmentalist approach was launched with the education and training of local experts in American universities who would think the same way as the American experts themselves. Returning home, these Western-educated locals entered government service and established bureaucratic strongholds, thus building American intellectual hegemony into the economic policy making of their countries. Joseph Stiglitz says, however, that economic policies are not neutral but ideological. Many of the technocratic proposals that may have worked in developed societies may encounter a different socio-economic context in developing countries and therefore are bound to fail. After Marcos was deposed and went into exile after the 1986 popular uprising, Cesar Virata and other martial law technocrats were effectively sidelined by the new government and initially ostracized by many in the business community. But this estrangement, however, did not last long. Virata returned to the private sector and established a management consultancy firm, and later joined the Yuchenko business conglomerate, where he became director and corporate vice chairman, Rizal Commercial and Banking Corporation, chairman and director, RCBC Realty Corporation, RCBC Forex Traders, RCBC Land, Pacific Fund, Coastal Road Corporation, and director, RCBC Savings Bank, RCBC Capital Corporation, Great Life Financial Assurance Corporation, Malayan Insurance Company, and the YGC Corporate Services. There's a lot of corporate titles. But other than this, he also became director of the Manila Electric Company, the Luisita Industrial Park Corporation, Business World Publishing Corporation, AY Foundation, and Bankcard Incorporated. He also serves as advisor to the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JP, Investment and Capital Corporation of the Philippines, City Land and Steel Corporation of the Philippines. Now this typically characterizes what I mentioned earlier about a revolving door practice in capitalist business firms and government. And it appears to be working well to the advantage of Cesar Virata. In skillfully utilizing this practice, he has apparently succeeded in overcoming the stigma of his unremarkable service during the martial law years. during the Marcos years and the martial law period, or has he? The Philippine martial law experience with the distributive justice program like agrarian reform reveals the severe limitations of the technocratic approach in dealing with real problems of real people. For mahal mga has, the heart of the problem lies in the discomfort that technocrats school in traditional economics undergo when faced with equity and social justice concerns. On the other hand, Joseph Stiglitz offers a more direct and succinct prescription, and I quote, "Don't trust technocrats." Unquote.